July 18, 1944. Normandy. The hedgerows. A German Obergefreiter crouches low in a foxhole carved into the root-choked earth. The air smells of wet clay and cordite. Around him, the bocage, ancient farmland walls of dirt and tangled brush, stands like a maze older than nations. Somewhere beyond the green walls, American voices. Not shouting, not frantic, calm, methodical, everywhere at once. He presses his helmet tighter against his skull. The voices crackle through the air like static ghosts. English words he cannot understand, but the rhythm is unmistakable. Coordinates, confirmations, updates. They are talking to each other, across hundreds of meters, across entire fields, without wires, without runners, without delay. His hands shake as he grips his carabiner. The Americans do not yell orders. They whisper them into black boxes strapped to their backs, and within seconds, mortars fall exactly where they intend. Machine guns reposition. Flanking units move as if guided by invisible threads. He has been a soldier for 3 years. He has fought in Poland, France, Russia. He knows war. But this is something else. To understand what terrified that German soldier in the summer of 1944, you must first understand what warfare sounded like before the Americans arrived. War, for most of human history, was loud and silent. Loud in the roar of guns and the screams of men, silent in the agonizing gaps between command and execution. Orders traveled at the speed of a running man, a galloping horse, or the unspooling of copper wire. Battles were won or lost in those gaps. Minutes could mean everything. Hours could mean annihilation. By 1939, the German Wehrmacht had refined a system that seemed, for a time, unbeatable. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It relied on speed, surprise, and the concentration of force at a single point. Panzer divisions smashed through enemy lines while dive bombers screamed overhead. But the coordination of this chaos depended on a rigid hierarchical command structure. Orders flowed downward from generals to colonels to captains to lieutenants. On the ground, company and platoon leaders relied on field telephones, heavy devices connected by miles of cable that had to be laid, protected, and constantly repaired. When the line was cut, communication stopped. Runners were sent, young men sprinting across open ground, praying they would not be shot before delivering a message that might already be obsolete. This system worked in Poland. It worked in France. It worked in the early days of the Soviet invasion, when German columns moved so fast that the enemy could not respond. But it had a flaw, one that would become fatal. The system assumed control. It assumed that the battlefield could be managed from above, that chaos could be contained by discipline and planning. It assumed that the man at the top knew more than the man in the trench. The Americans assumed the opposite. The United States entered World War II with a different philosophy, one born not from Prussian military academies, but from the vastness of its own geography and the pragmatism of its industrial culture. American officers believed that the soldier on the ground, the sergeant, the corporal, even the private, could make decisions if given the right tools. They believed that war was too fast, too fluid, too unpredictable to be controlled from a distant headquarters, so they gave their soldiers radios. Not just radios for officers, radios for everyone. The SCR-300, developed by the Signal Corps and manufactured by companies like Motorola, weighed 35 pounds. It was strapped to a man's back like a pack, with a handset clipped to his chest. It could transmit voice communications up to 3 miles in open terrain, less in forests or urban areas, but still far enough to change everything. A platoon leader could call for artillery support without sending a runner. A squad leader could warn another squad of an enemy position without shouting. A forward observer could adjust mortar fire in real time, watching the impacts and correcting them with his voice. The Germans had radios too, of course. The Torn FUD-2 and other models were used at the company and battalion level. But they were heavier, less reliable, and crucially, not distributed down to the smallest units. A German infantry squad had no radio. A German platoon often had none. communication happened face-to-face or through runners. When a German officer needed to call for support, he had to find a telephone, assuming the line had not been cut. If it had, he waited, or he sent a man, and that man ran through fire. The American system was different not just in technology, but in trust. The U.S. Army trained its soldiers to use radios as naturally as they used their rifles. Radio operators were not specialists isolated in a command post. They were riflemen who carried an extra burden. The SCR-300 became as common in American infantry units as the M1 Garand. By 1944, nearly every U.S. rifle company had multiple radios. Platoons had them. Even some squads had them. The entire structure of American infantry tactics assumed that voices could travel faster than feet. This assumption changed the nature of battle. Before Normandy, American forces tested and refined their radio doctrine in North Africa and Italy. In the deserts of Tunisia, where visibility stretched for miles, radios allowed American units to coordinate movements across vast distances. Tank commanders could speak directly to infantry officers. Artillery observers could call in fire missions without waiting for approval from higher command. The system was not perfect. Static, interference, and dead zones plagued transmissions, but it worked well enough to prove its value. By the time the Americans prepared for D-Day, the radio was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine, the Signal Corps response. Bible for all military communications had spent the years before the war developing portable radio technology. In the 1930s, radios were bulky, fragile, and required external power sources. The idea of a man carrying a radio into combat seemed impractical. But engineers at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, worked with private companies to miniaturize components, improve battery life, and ruggedize equipment for the chaos of the battlefield. Motorola, founded by Paul Galvin, played a critical role. The company had made its name with car radios, hence the name, a combination of motor and Victrola. But by the late 1930s, it was designing two-way radios for police departments. When the war began, Motorola adapted its designs for military use. The handheld SCR-536, nicknamed the Handy Talkie, had a range of only 1 mile, but it was light enough for a single soldier to carry without a backpack. The SCR-300, heavier but more powerful, became the backbone of American battlefield communications. Training was just as important as technology. The U.S. Army did not simply hand radios to soldiers and hope for the best. Radio procedure was drilled into every infantry unit. Call signs, brevity codes, and radio discipline were taught until they became instinctive. Soldiers learned to speak in short, clear bursts to minimize transmission time and reduce the chance of interception. They learned to use terrain to their advantage, positioning themselves on high ground to extend their range. They learned to carry spare batteries, to protect their equipment from water and mud, and to fix minor malfunctions in the field. The radio was not a luxury. It was a weapon. By June 1944, when the first waves of American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the U.S. Army had more radios per capita than any military force in history. The Germans, watching from their bunkers and hedgerows, had no idea what was coming. They knew the Americans had radios, captured equipment, and intelligence reports made that clear, but they did not understand the scale. They did not understand that a single American platoon could coordinate with artillery, air support, and neighboring units faster than a German battalion could relay a message to its headquarters. They did not understand that the Americans had decentralized warfare itself, pushing decision-making down to the lowest levels and trusting sergeants to call in fire missions that, in the Wehrmacht, would have required approval from a major or a colonel. The hedgerows of Normandy became a laboratory for this new kind of war. The bocage was a defender's paradise. Narrow lanes hemmed in by centuries-old earthen walls topped with dense hedges. Visibility was measured in meters. Tanks could not maneuver. Artillery could not see its targets. For the Germans, it was ideal terrain. They dug in, covered every lane with machine guns, and waited. For the Americans, it was a nightmare, until they learned to turn their radios into eyes. Forward observers moved with the lead squads, radios on their backs. When they spotted a German position, they did not retreat to a command post. They called it in immediately. Within minutes, artillery shells began falling on the target. If the first salvo missed, the observer adjusted. Add 50, left 20. Another salvo. Adjust again. The Germans, used to long pauses between artillery barrages, found themselves under continuous, precise fire. They could not understand how the Americans were doing it. There were no telephone lines to cut, no runners to intercept. The shells just kept coming, each round closer than the last. Tank infantry coordination, previously a clumsy affair requiring shouting and hand signals, became seamless. Tankers carried radios that let them speak directly to the infantry squads moving alongside them. When a panzer appeared in a hedgerow, the infantry radioed its position to the tanks, and the tanks maneuvered to engage. And the tanks needed infantry to clear a position. They called for it. The two forces moved as one organism, responding to threats faster than the enemy could react. German doctrine, which kept tanks and infantry in separate commands, could not adapt. Their tanks advanced without infantry support. Their infantry fought without armor. The Americans, by contrast, blended both into a single flexible force held together by radio waves. Even small unit tactics changed. An American squad pinned down by a German machine gun did not need to wait for orders. The squad leader radioed the platoon leader, who radioed the company commander, who radioed the battalion fire support officer, all within seconds. Mortars adjusted their aim. Smoke shells landed in front of the machine gun, blinding it. The squad advanced under cover. The entire sequence, from contact to suppression, took less than 2 minutes. A German squad in the same situation would have sent a runner, waited for orders, and hoped the machine gun did not kill them all before help arrived. The psychological impact of this speed was immense. German soldiers, even veterans, began to feel that the Americans knew everything. They seemed to anticipate every move. They seemed to be everywhere at once. The truth was simpler. The Americans did not know everything. They simply communicated what they did know faster than the Germans could respond. A squad spotting a German patrol radioed its location to other squads, who radioed it to company headquarters, who radioed it to artillery. By the time the German patrol realized it had been seen, shells were already in the air. The Americans did not need omniscience. They only needed speed. And speed in war is a kind of magic. The German soldier in the foxhole did not know any of this. He did not know about the Signal Corps or Motorola or the SCR-300. He knew only that the Americans could talk to each other without wires, that they could summon fire from the sky with a whisper, that they moved through the hedgerows like ghosts who saw through walls. He had been told the Americans were soft, that they relied on machines because they lacked discipline. But there was nothing soft about the men advancing toward him. They were disciplined, they were coordinated, and they were coming. To understand the full scope of what the radio meant, you must see it from multiple angles: human, technological, tactical, and moral. Each perspective reveals a different facet of the same revolution, a revolution that did not announce itself with fanfare, but crept across the battlefields of Europe in the voices of young men speaking into black boxes. From the German perspective, the American radio was a source of profound confusion and fear. German soldiers had been taught to respect their enemy's courage and skill, but they had also been told that German training, discipline, and equipment were superior. The appearance of radios at the squad and platoon level shattered that belief. A Gefreiter captured near St. Lo in late July 1944 described his experience to American interrogators. He said that the Americans seemed to know everything before it happened. When his squad tried to move to a new position, mortar fire landed on them before they arrived. When they tried to flank an American position, the Americans were already waiting. He thought at first that the Americans had spies, local French civilians reporting German movements, but there were no civilians in the hedgerows. There was only the crackling of voices on the radio, voices his officers could not intercept because they did not have the right equipment or the right codes. Another prisoner, an underofficer from the 352nd Infantry Division, reported that his company commander had tried to use captured American radios to listen to U.S. transmissions. It did not work. The Americans used brevity codes, short, prearranged phrases that meant nothing to an outsider. Red 6, this is Red 2. Fire mission. Over. Roger. Red 2. Send it. The words were English, but their meaning was opaque. The Germans could hear the conversations, but they could not understand them in time to act. By the time a German intelligence officer translated a transmission and relayed it to the front, the Americans had already moved. The fear was not just tactical, it was existential. German soldiers began to believe that the Americans had a supernatural advantage, that they possessed a kind of battlefield omniscience granted by their machines. This belief was irrational, but it was powerful. Fear, once planted, grows quickly in the soil of war. German morale, already strained by months of fighting and the relentless pressure of Allied air superiority, cracked further under the weight of this invisible enemy. You could shoot a man, you could destroy a tank, but how do you fight voices in the air? From a technological standpoint, the SCR-300 was not a miraculous device. It was a frequency-modulated radio transmitter and receiver operating in the VHF band, around 40 to 48 megahertz. It used vacuum tubes, which were fragile and consumed significant battery power. The batteries, BA-70 types, lasted only about 12 hours of continuous use, and replacements were heavy. The range was limited by terrain, weather, and interference. In dense forests, the signal could drop to less than a mile. In cities, buildings absorbed and reflected the radio waves, creating dead zones. Rain and humidity caused static. The handset was prone to breaking. The antenna, or pole, long metal rod, could snag on branches or give away a soldier's position. But despite these limitations, the SCR-300 was a masterpiece of practical engineering. It was designed to be operated by soldiers, not technicians. The controls were simple: an on-off switch, a volume knob, and a tuning dial. The handset, modeled after a telephone receiver, was intuitive. You pressed a button to talk, released it to listen. That was it. No Morse code, no complicated procedures. Even a soldier with minimal training could use it effectively. And because it used FM instead of AM, the signal was clearer and less susceptible to interference from electrical equipment like vehicle engines. The Germans, by contrast, used radios that required more technical knowledge. The Torn Few D2, the standard German infantry radio, was heavier than the SCR-300 and had a shorter range. It required a trained operator and could not be easily used by a common soldier. German radio doctrine reflected this limitation. Radios were issued to battalion and company headquarters, not to platoons or squads. Communication from company to platoon relied on field telephones or runners. This created a bottleneck. Information flowed upward slowly, and orders flowed downward even more slowly. The American system, by contrast, was a network. Information flowed in all directions simultaneously. A platoon leader could talk to his squads, his company commander, and his artillery support officer without going through a central switchboard. The network was resilient. If one radio failed, the others compensated. If a platoon leader was killed, his radio man could take over. The system degraded gracefully instead of collapsing. From a tactical perspective, the radio enabled a style of warfare that the Germans could not match. The U.S. Army called it combined arms at the lowest level. It meant that even a small unit, a platoon or a company, could call on the full spectrum of military power: infantry, air, or more, artillery, air support, and engineers. A platoon leader in Normandy had more firepower at his disposal than a German regimental commander in 1940. He did not have to ask permission. He did not have to wait for orders. He assessed the situation, made a decision, and called for what he needed. If he needed artillery, he radioed the fire support officer. If he needed air support, he radioed the forward air controller. If he needed tanks, he radioed the armor unit attached to his battalion. The response was not always immediate, but it was fast enough to matter. This decentralization terrified German officers as much as it terrified German soldiers. The Wehrmacht was built on the principle of Auftragstactik, mission-type orders, which gave subordinate officers freedom to achieve objectives using their own methods. But that freedom had limits. A German platoon leader could decide how to attack a position, but he could not call in an artillery barrage without approval from higher command. He could not request air support. He could not redirect tanks. Those decisions required authorization from officers who were often miles away, receiving information that was already outdated. The American system inverted this hierarchy. The man closest to the fight had the most power. The man farthest away, the general, provided resources and guidance, but did not micromanage. This required a level of trust that the German military, for all its vaunted professionalism, could not achieve. The tactical advantages compounded. American artillery became devastatingly effective because forward observers could adjust fire in real time. In previous wars, artillery was a blunt instrument. Guns fired at pre-planned coordinates, and if the enemy was not there, the shells were wasted. Adjusting fire required visual signals, flags, flares, or runners, which were slow and conspicuous. The radio changed everything. An observer watched the shells land, estimated the error, and radioed a correction. Drop 100, right 50. The next salvo was closer. Another correction. Another salvo. Within minutes, the guns were hitting the target with precision that seemed impossible. German soldiers, used to artillery that fired in predictable patterns, found themselves under bombardment that followed them as they moved. They could not hide because the shells adjusted to find them. They could not retreat because the observer saw them retreating and called in more fire. Air support became similarly precise. Before radios, calling in airstrikes required prearranged plans. Pilots bombed coordinates given to them hours earlier, often hitting empty fields because the enemy had moved. With radios, forward air controllers could talk directly to pilots circling overhead. Enemy armor, 200 meters north of my position, moving east. The pilot confirmed the target, dived, and released his bombs. If he missed, the controller corrected him. Add 100 meters. The pilot came around again. This level of coordination was unheard of in 1939. By 1944, it was routine for American forces. The moral dimension of the radio is harder to quantify, but no less important. The American soldier carrying an SCR-300 knew that he was not alone. He could hear the voices of other units. He could call for help, and know that help would come. This knowledge affected his behavior. He took risks he might not have taken if he were isolated. He advanced when a soldier without a radio might have hesitated. The radio did not make him braver, but it made bravery more rational. Courage is easier when you know that your death will not be meaningless, that your voice will reach someone who can act on the information you provide. The German soldier, by contrast, felt increasingly isolated. His officers could not communicate with each other quickly. His squad could not call for support. If he was pinned down, he had to wait for a runner to reach headquarters, wait for orders to be issued, wait for reinforcements to arrive. Often, they never did. The hedgerows were littered with the bodies of German soldiers who died waiting for help that came too late or not at all. The psychological impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. War is terrifying enough when you believe your side is organized and competent. When you begin to suspect that your commanders cannot see the battlefield, that your calls for help are unheard, that you are fighting blind while the enemy sees everything, the terror becomes existential. The radio also created a new kind of leadership. American sergeants and lieutenants, equipped with radios, became more independent and more powerful than their rank suggested. A sergeant commanding a squad could call in artillery, redirect machine gun fire, or coordinate with a tank platoon. He did not need to consult his captain because the captain trusted him to make the right call. This distributed leadership made American units resilient. If a lieutenant was killed, the sergeant took over. If the sergeant was killed, a corporal with a radio could continue the mission. The Germans, with their more rigid hierarchy, struggled to adapt when officers were killed. A German company without its captain was often paralyzed. An American company without its captain kept fighting. There were moral complexities, too. The radio made killing more efficient, more impersonal. An artillery observer could call in fire on a German position without seeing the men he was killing. A forward air controller could guide a bomber to a target without witnessing the explosion. This distance, this abstraction, troubled some American soldiers. They understood that the radio was saving American lives, but they also understood that it was taking German lives with a cold efficiency that felt different from shooting a man face to face. The radio turned war into a conversation. The radio turned war into a conversation. You spoke into a handset, and somewhere people died. The cause and effect was clear, but the connection felt unreal. Yet for all its power, the radio was not invincible. The Germans learned slowly to adapt. They began targeting American soldiers with radios, recognizing that the man with the pack and the antenna was worth killing. They trained snipers to look for radio operators. They used direction-finding equipment to locate American transmissions and call in artillery. They jammed frequencies when they could, though their jamming equipment was limited and often ineffective. They tried to spread rumors among their own troops that American radios did not work as well as they seemed, that the Americans were bluffing, that the radio was just another machine that could fail. But the rumors did not stick. The evidence was too overwhelming. The Americans kept coordinating, kept adjusting their fire, kept moving with a speed and precision that the Germans could not match. By late 1944, the radio had become so integral to American tactics that it was invisible. Soldiers did not think about it any more than they thought about their boots or their helmets. It was simply part of how they fought. The Germans, still struggling to distribute radios to their platoons, still relying on runners and field telephones, found themselves fighting an enemy that lived in a different era. The gap was not measured in years, but in the speed of information. The Germans moved at the pace of 1939. The Americans moved at the pace of 1944. And that difference, that gap of 5 years compressed into the crackling voices on a radio, was unbridgeable. The voices continued, calm, methodical, everywhere at once. And the Germans, listening, began to understand that they were not fighting men. They were fighting a system that saw them, heard them, and it responded faster than they could think. A system held together not by wire, not by discipline, not by tradition, but by voices traveling through the air at the speed of light. The turning point came not in a single battle, but in a cascade of moments across the summer and fall of 1944, moments when the accumulated weight of American radio superiority tipped the balance from advantage to dominance. The Germans, skilled and experienced, could adapt to many things. They adapted to Allied air superiority by moving at night. They adapted to superior numbers by fighting from prepared defenses. But they could not adapt to an enemy that communicated faster than they could think. Speed, in the end, was the weapon that broke them. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, 1944, was the first demonstration of what American radio coordination could achieve on a massive scale. For weeks, the Allies had been locked in the bocage, grinding forward at horrific cost. The hedgerows negated every Allied advantage. Air power could not see through the canopy, tanks could not maneuver in the narrow lanes, and artillery could not observe its targets. The Germans, dug in and resupplied by night, held every inch of ground with machine guns and mortars. American casualties mounted. Divisions bled white, trying to advance a few hundred meters. The breakout seemed impossible. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, designed Cobra as a hammer blow. He would concentrate every available bomber, 2,500 aircraft, on a rectangular strip of land 5 miles wide and 1 mile deep, just west of St. Lo. The bombs would pulverize the German defenses, and immediately afterward, American armor would punch through the gap. The plan was simple, but its execution depended on timing so precise that it seemed impossible. The bombers had to drop their payload in a narrow corridor without hitting American troops. PS position just yards away. The ground forces had to advance the instant the last bomb fell, before the Germans could recover. And the armor, following behind the infantry, had to exploit the breach before the Germans could plug it with reserves. Radios made it possible. Forward air controllers, positioned with the lead infantry units, carried SCR-300s, tuned to the same frequency as the bomber command. They marked the front line with colored smoke and radioed the pilots to confirm that they saw the markers. They watched the first waves of bombers approach, watched the bomb bay doors open, watched the bombs tumble down. Some fell short. American soldiers died in the explosions, killed by their own bombs. The forward air controllers radioed frantically, adjusting the drop zone, guiding the later waves of bombers away from friendly positions. The corrections were not perfect. More Americans died. But without the radios, the entire bombing run would have been a massacre. The controllers saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of American lives by making real-time adjustments that would have been impossible in any previous war. The bombing lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, a corridor of devastation stretched across the German line. Trees were shredded into splinters. Craters overlapped craters. German soldiers, those who survived, staggered through the smoke, bleeding from their ears, blind and deaf from concussion. The Americans attacked immediately. Infantry squads, each with a radio, advanced into the smoking wasteland. They radioed back reports. Resistance here, none there. Tanks needed at this grid coordinate. Artillery needed at that one. Battalion commanders, listening to these reports, redirected forces in real time. Armor poured through gaps that infantry identified. Artillery shifted fire to targets that forward observers spotted. The entire operation moved like a single organism, responding to information as quickly as it was gathered. The Germans tried to react. Reserve units scrambled forward, but they moved blind. Their radio network, already strained, collapsed under the chaos. Field telephone lines, severed by the bombing, could not be repaired fast enough. Runners, sent to carry orders, were killed by roving American patrols or lost in the confusion. German commanders, isolated in their headquarters, issued orders based on information that was hours old. By the time their reserves arrived, the Americans had already moved. Positions that were supposed to be defended were empty. Counterattacks aimed at American spearheads hit empty air. The German response, organized and coherent on paper, disintegrated into a series of uncoordinated local actions. Each German unit fought bravely, but they fought alone. The American advance, by contrast, was chaos that looked like order. Individual units made decisions on the fly, but those decisions were informed by constant communication. A tank platoon encountering a German strongpoint did not charge blindly. The platoon leader radioed for infantry support. The infantry radioed for artillery to suppress the strongpoint. The artillery radioed the tanks to tell them when to advance. The sequence happened in minutes, sometimes seconds. The Germans, watching this coordination, could not understand how the Americans were doing it. It seemed impossible that so many units could act in concert without detailed pre-planning. But the Americans were not following a plan. They were improvising, and the radio let them improvise together. Within 3 days, the German line shattered. American armor raced south and west, covering in hours what had taken weeks to advance in the hedgerows. German units, trying to retreat, found themselves surrounded. Without radios, they could not coordinate their withdrawal. Units collided with each other on narrow roads, creating traffic jams that American aircraft strafed with impunity. Division commanders lost contact with their regiments. Regimental commanders lost contact with their battalions. The Wehrmacht, so proud of its command structure, dissolved into a mob of isolated units fleeing in different directions. The Americans, following close behind, picked them off one by one. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers who survived Cobra spoke of the battle with a kind of traumatized awe. They had experienced bombing before. The Allies had been bombing Germany for years, but this was different. The bombing was not random or indiscriminate. It was surgical. It targeted the exact strip of land where the Germans were strongest, and the moment it ended, the Americans attacked, as if they had been standing on the edge of the craters, waiting for the dust to settle. The coordination, the timing, the relentless forward momentum, it all seemed inhuman. Prisoners told their interrogators that the Americans must have had spies, informants, agents embedded in the German units. The interrogators did not correct them. Let the Germans believe in spies. It was easier than explaining that the Americans simply talked to each other faster. But Cobra was only the beginning. The radio had proven its worth in attack, but its true test came in defense. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. At 5:30 in the morning, German artillery erupted along an 80-mile front. Over 1,000 guns fired simultaneously, shredding the winter darkness with light and sound. For an hour the barrage continued, pounding American positions in the snowbound forest. Then, out of the fog, came the tanks. Panzers and Panthers and Tigers, engines roaring, tracks clanking, moving through the trees like iron ghosts. Behind them, German infantry in white winter camouflage, thousands of them, advancing in silence. Hitler had gambled everything on one last offensive. He had scraped together his reserves, divisions pulled from the Eastern Front, tanks pulled from training units, fuel siphoned from the last reserves in Germany, and thrown them at the weakest point in the American line. The Ardennes was thinly held, defended by green divisions and exhausted veterans sent there to rest. Hitler believed that if he could break through and reach the coast, he could split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all Germany had left. The Americans, caught off guard, fell back. Entire regiments were surrounded. Communication lines were cut. Command posts were overrun. In the chaos of the first hours, it seemed that the German gamble might succeed. The front collapsed in places, and German armor poured through the gaps. But then, the radios began to work. At Bastogne, a critical crossroads town, the 101st Airborne Division dug in and refused to move. Surrounded by German forces, cut off from supply lines, the paratroopers radioed for help. Their call was heard, not by the nearest headquarters, which had been overrun, but by units 50 miles away. The radio signal, bouncing through relay stations, reached Corps headquarters and then Army headquarters. Within hours, Patton's Third Army, fighting to the south, received orders to turn north and relieve Bastogne. Patton, a man who understood speed, understood immediately what the radios allowed him to do. He did not wait for detailed plans or written orders. He radioed his division commanders directly, told them to turn 90 degrees and attack north, and trusted them to figure out the details. 3 divisions, over 60,000 men, changed direction in less than 48 hours. It was a logistical miracle made possible by voices on the radio. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers held on. They were outnumbered, outgunned and surrounded, but they were not isolated. Forward air controllers, equipped with radios, called in airstrikes whenever the weather cleared. Fighter bombers screamed out of the low clouds, bombing and strafing German positions with a precision that shocked the attackers. The Germans, advancing through the snow, could not understand how the Americans knew where they were. The answer was simple. American forward observers, hidden in buildings and foxholes, watched the Germans move and radioed their positions to the aircraft overhead. The planes, guided by these voices, delivered their payloads within meters of the intended targets. German forces, trying to tighten the noose around Bastogne, found themselves under constant artillery fire. The American artillery batteries, positioned outside the encirclement, fired continuously based on coordinates radioed from inside the town. The Germans tried to jam the transmissions, but American radios used frequency modulation and brevity codes that made jamming difficult. They tried to cut the radio operators off from the rest of the garrison, but the radios had a range of several miles and did not depend on physical lines. They tried to capture the radios, but the paratroopers guarded them as fiercely as they guarded their ammunition. The radios were ammunition. Without them, Bastogne would have fallen in days. The siege lasted a week. On December 26th, Patton's forces broke through the German lines and reached Bastogne. The relief column, guided by radio transmissions from the surrounded garrison, advanced with a speed that the Germans could not counter. German reserves, ordered to block Patton's advance, arrived too late because their orders took too long to transmit. By the time German commanders realized what was happening, American tanks were already entering Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge raged for another month, but the relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end. The Germans had achieved surprise and initial success, but they could not sustain their momentum. because they could not coordinate their forces as quickly as the Americans could. Every German advance was met by American reinforcements that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Every German attack was disrupted by artillery that adjusted its fire faster than the attackers could move. The Germans fought with courage and skill, but they were fighting an enemy that existed in a different time stream, an enemy that processed information and responded at a speed the Germans could not match. Captured German officers, interrogated after the battle, expressed bewilderment at the American response time. One Oberst, commanding a panzer regiment, said that his unit had been taught to expect a delay of at least 2 hours between an American unit spotting them and artillery fire landing on their position. In the Ardennes, the delay was often less than 5 minutes. He had assumed the Americans had pre-planned every artillery mission. But his interrogators told him the truth. The artillery was responding to real-time reports from forward observers with radios. The Oberst did not believe it at first. It seemed impossible. No army, he insisted, could coordinate that quickly. But the evidence was undeniable. His regiment had been shattered by artillery fire that followed his tanks as they moved, that adjusted with every turn, that seemed to know where he was going before he got there. He had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He had never experienced anything like it. Another officer, a major from the 1st SS Panzer Division, described the psychological impact. His men, he said, began to believe the Americans could see in the dark. They advanced at night to avoid airstrikes, but even in darkness, American artillery found them. They changed routes to avoid predictable paths, but the shells still landed. The major eventually realized the Americans were using radios to coordinate their defenses, but by then it was too late. His division, one of the most elite in the German military, had been reduced to scattered remnants. The survivors spoke of invisible eyes, of an enemy that watched from everywhere and nowhere. The major understood that the eyes were not invisible. They were simply connected by radio waves, but understanding did not make the experience less terrifying. The winter of 1944 ground on. The Germans retreated, slowly at first, then with increasing desperation. They fought for every village, every bridge, every crossroad, but they fought without the coordination that had once made them formidable. Their radio network, never as extensive as the American system, collapsed under the strain of constant combat and dwindling resources. Replacement radios were not available. Batteries could not be resupplied. Trained operators were dead or captured. The Wehrmacht reverted to the communication methods of an earlier age, field telephones with wires that were cut hourly, runners who died crossing open ground, shouted orders that were misheard or forgotten. The Americans, by contrast, maintained their radio network even as their forces advanced deeper into Germany. Radio operators were replaced. Batteries were airlifted to forward units. New radios arrived from factories in the United States at a rate that the Germans could not comprehend. The industrial might of America, channeled through the simple technology of the radio, became a force multiplier that no amount of German courage or skill could overcome. By February 1945, the Allies had pushed the Germans back to the Rhine. The great river, the last natural barrier protecting Germany's heartland, loomed ahead. Crossing it would require coordination on a scale unprecedented in military history. Engineers building bridges under fire, infantry securing bridgeheads, armor racing across before the Germans could counterattack, artillery suppressing enemy positions on the far bank, and air support preventing German reinforcements from reaching. Guess G, the battle. Every element had to work in perfect synchronization, and the window of opportunity would be measured in hours, perhaps minutes. A single failure could turn the crossing into a massacre. The radios made it possible. On March 7, 1945, soldiers of the U.S. 9th Armored Division approached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. They expected the bridge to be destroyed. Every other bridge across the Rhine had been blown by retreating German forces, but as they advanced, they saw the bridge still standing. German engineers had rigged it with explosives, but the demolition had failed. The bridge was damaged, but intact. The American officers on the scene understood immediately that they had been given a gift. If they could seize the bridge before the Germans destroyed it, the entire Allied advance could be accelerated by weeks. But they also understood the risk. German artillery on the far bank could turn the bridge into a killing ground. German reinforcements could counterattack and destroy the small American force that crossed. The decision to attack had to be made instantly, and it had to be communicated up the chain of command fast enough for higher headquarters to support it. The platoon leader radioed his company commander. The company commander radioed the battalion commander. The battalion commander radioed the division commander. Each transmission took seconds, not minutes. Within 10 minutes of spotting the intact bridge, the order came back. Take it. Infantry squads, covered by tanks, rushed across the bridge while engineers cut the demolition wires. German artillery opened fire, shells exploding on the bridge and in the river below. American soldiers ran through the barrage, some of them dying, others reaching the far side and securing a toehold. Forward observers crossing with the infantry immediately began calling in counter-battery fire on the German artillery positions. American guns, positioned miles away, responded within minutes. The German guns fell silent one by one, destroyed or forced to displace. More American units poured across. Within an hour, an entire battalion was on the east bank. Within 3 hours, engineers had begun repairing the bridge and constructing pontoon bridges nearby. Within a day, thousands of American soldiers and hundreds of vehicles had crossed the Rhine. The German High Command, receiving reports of the breakthrough, ordered an immediate counterattack. But the orders took hours to reach the units that were supposed to execute them. And by the time those units arrived, the American bridgehead was too strong to dislodge. The radios had turned opportunity into reality faster than the Germans could react. The crossing at Remagen became a symbol of Allied coordination. Eisenhower, the supreme commander, later said that the seizure of the bridge shortened the war by weeks and saved thousands of lives. But the bridge itself was not the key. Bridges had been captured before. The key was the speed with which the decision was made and executed, the speed with which reinforcements were called forward, the speed with which artillery support was provided. That speed came from radios. Without them, the opportunity would have been lost. The platoon leader would have sent a runner to the company commander. The company commander would have sent a runner to the battalion commander. By the time the message reached someone with the authority to act, the Germans would have blown the bridge or reinforced it so heavily that an assault would be suicidal. The radio collapsed time. It turned minutes into seconds, and those seconds made the difference between victory and failure. Across Germany, the pattern repeated. American forces advanced with a speed that the Germans found incomprehensible. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, but they did not break because logistics officers coordinated by radio. Tank columns raced ahead of the infantry, confident that if they encountered resistance, they could call for support, and it would arrive. German units, trying to form defensive lines, found themselves outflanked before they finished digging in. The Americans seemed to know every weak point, every gap, every route through the countryside. The truth was simpler. American reconnaissance units radioed back information continuously, and commanders at every level adjusted their plans in real time based on that information. The Germans, still relying on periodic situation reports and scheduled communications, were always reacting to situations that had already changed. The moral collapse of the Wehrmacht in the final months of the war was not just a result of material shortages or casualties. It was a result of the growing realization that they were fighting an enemy they could not match. German soldiers had been willing to die for their country, but dying requires belief. Belief that your sacrifice serves a purpose, that your commanders know what they are doing, that your side has a chance. The radio stripped away that belief. It made clear that the Americans operated at a tempo the Germans could not sustain, that American commanders saw the battlefield in a way German commanders did not, that every German position was known and targeted before it could be reinforced. The Wehrmacht did not surrender because it ran out of soldiers. It surrendered because it ran out of hope. The aftermath of the war revealed the full extent of the radio's impact, not just on the battles themselves, but on the future of warfare. The lessons learned in Normandy and the Ardennes and across Germany were not forgotten. They became doctrine. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. American soldiers, many of them still carrying their SCR-300 radios, began the long journey home. The radios, scuffed and dented and stained with mud, were turned into supply depots or thrown onto scrap heaps. They had served their purpose. But the idea they represented, the idea that communication could be a weapon, that speed of information could determine the outcome of battle, did not die with them. The United States Army, analyzing the lessons of the war, concluded that radio communication at the lowest levels had been one of the decisive factors in Allied victory. Post-war studies compared casualty rates, battle outcomes, and time-to-target metrics between units with and without radios. The data was overwhelming. Units equipped with radios at the platoon and squad level suffered fewer casualties, accomplished their objectives faster, and required less support from higher headquarters. The radio did not make soldiers invincible, but it made them more effective by almost every measurable standard. German officers, interviewed as prisoners of war and later as part of historical research projects, confirmed what the data showed. General der Panzertruppen, Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge, stated bluntly that American radio superiority had been a deciding factor. He noted that German units could not coordinate their actions quickly enough to exploit breakthroughs or respond to threats. By the time orders reached the front, the situation had changed. American units, by contrast, adapted continuously. Manteuffel said that fighting the Americans felt like fighting an opponent who could see the entire chessboard while he could see only a few squares. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, a staff officer who served on both the Eastern and Western fronts, wrote in his post-war memoirs that the German army had underestimated the importance of tactical communications. The Wehrmacht had focused on operational-level radios, those used by divisions and corps, but neglected company and platoon communications. Von Mellenthin argued that this was a strategic mistake, one that could not be corrected once the war began. Building a radio network required not just equipment, but training, doctrine, and a culture that trusted junior leaders to make decisions. The German military culture, for all its emphasis on initiative, was still hierarchical. Trust flowed downward slowly. The American system, which assumed that a sergeant with a radio could be trusted to call in artillery, was alien to German thinking. The Soviet Union, watching the American performance from the East, drew its own conclusions. Soviet commanders had used radios during the war, but their system was even more centralized than the German one. Radio communication was tightly controlled by political officers and senior commanders. Junior officers and enlisted men were not trusted with radios, partly because of concerns about security and partly because of ideological reasons. The Communist Party feared that decentralized communication could lead to decentralized thinking, but the success of the American system could not be ignored. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the Soviet military began to expand its radio networks and distribute radios more widely. The process was slow and fraught with bureaucratic resistance, but it happened. The Cold War arms race included not just nuclear weapons and tanks, but radios and communication systems. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949, adopted American radio doctrine as its standard. NATO forces trained to use radios at every level, from squad to army group. Standardized radio procedures, call signs, and frequencies allowed units from different countries to communicate with each other. This interoperability became a cornerstone of NATO's military effectiveness. A British forward observer could call in American artillery. A Canadian infantry platoon could request air support from a French squadron. The radio network became the glue that held the alliance together. In Korea, less than 5 years after the end of World War II, American forces used radios in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1939. Helicopter pilots equipped with radios coordinated medical evacuations from the battlefield. Forward air controllers, flying in light aircraft, directed jet fighters to targets identified by ground troops. Artillery batteries, positioned behind the front lines, received fire missions by radio and responded within minutes. The North Korean and Chinese forces, lacking equivalent radio networks, suffered the same disadvantages the Germans had suffered. They were brave, disciplined, and numerous, but they were slow. slow to react, slow to coordinate, slow to adapt. The Americans, once again, operated at a tempo their enemies could not match. The technology evolved. Transistors replaced vacuum tubes, making radios smaller, lighter, and more reliable. Battery life improved. Range increased. By the 1960s, a radio that would have weighed 35 pounds in 1944 weighed less than 5. By the 1970s, radios were small enough to be carried by individual soldiers, not just radiomen. By the 1980s, digital encryption made transmission secure from interception. By the 1990s, satellite communication allowed a soldier in a desert or jungle to talk to commanders on another continent. The SCR-300, primitive by modern standards, had opened a door that led to a world where communication was instant, global, and ubiquitous. But the principles remained the same. The soldier closest to the fight needed to be able to communicate. Information needed to flow quickly in all directions, not just up and down the chain of command. Trust needed to be placed in the judgment of junior leaders. The radio did not create these principles, but it made them possible. Without the radio, decentralized warfare was a theory. With the radio, it was reality. The human cost of the radio revolution is harder to measure. American soldiers who used radios in combat often said that the device saved their lives. They could call for help when they were surrounded. They could warn others of danger. They could coordinate their actions and avoid friendly fire. The radio reduced the fog of war, and in doing so, it reduced the number of deaths caused by confusion, miscommunication, and isolation. But it also increased the pace of war. Battles that might have taken days in an earlier era were compressed into hours. Soldiers experienced more combat, more stress, more trauma in shorter periods. The radio made war more efficient, and efficiency in war is a double-edged sword. For the Germans, the psychological impact lingered long after the war ended. Veterans spoke of the American radios with a kind of grudging respect mixed with resentment. They felt that the Americans had won not through superior courage or skill, but through superior technology, that the radios were an unfair advantage, a kind of cheating. This perspective ignored the fact that technology is part of war, that the Americans had invested in radio development and training while the Germans had invested in other areas. But the feeling persisted. The German soldier who had fought bravely and lost wanted to believe that he had been defeated by something beyond his control, something that skill and courage could not overcome. The radio became, in memory, a symbol of that something, an invisible, omnipresent force that saw everything and struck with impunity. American veterans, by contrast, rarely spoke about the radios. To them, the radio was just a tool, like a rifle or a helmet. It was so integrated into their experience of war that it became invisible in memory. When they told stories of combat, they mentioned calling for artillery or coordinating with tanks, but they did not dwell on the radios that made those actions possible. The radio was the medium through which war happened, and like all media, it was noticed only when it failed. The countless times it worked, the countless lives it saved, the countless battles it influenced, these faded into the background of memory, taken for granted. Historians, examining the war decades later, have tried to quantify the radio's contribution. Some have argued that radio communication was as important as any single weapon system, more important than any single battle. Others have placed it in the context of a broader Allied advantage in logistics, industry, and coordination. The debate continues, but the evidence is clear. The Americans won not just because they had more tanks, or more planes, or more men, though they had all of those things. They won because they used what they had more effectively, and the radio was the tool that made that effectiveness possible. The legacy of the SCR-300 and the radios that followed it is written in every military in the world today. There is no modern army that does not rely on communications equipment at every level. The squad radio, the helicopter radio, the tank radio, the satellite phone, all of them are descendants of the devices that American soldiers carried through the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. The technology has advanced beyond recognition, but the principle remains. War is fought by humans, and humans must communicate to coordinate their actions. The side that communicates faster, more clearly, and more reliably has an advantage that can outweigh differences in numbers, firepower, or terrain. The radio taught the world a lesson that has been relearned in every conflict since 1944. Information is power, speed is life, isolation is death. These truths, ancient in principle, became tangible and measurable through the technology of radio communication. The German soldier in the foxhole, listening to American voices crackling through the air, understood this truth even if he could not articulate it. He understood that he was not just fighting men. He was fighting a system, a network, a web of voices that saw him before he saw them, that responded to him before he could act, that surrounded him without ever closing in. And in the end, that was what magic looked like in war. Not fireballs or lightning bolts, not invincibility or omniscience, just voices. Calm voices, speaking in short bursts, coordinating movements, adjusting fire, calling for support. Voices that traveled at the speed of light, binding soldiers together across miles of battlefield, turning chaos into order and order into victory. The Germans called it magic because they could not understand it, because it seemed to defy the rules of war as they knew them. But it was not magic. It was engineering. It was training. It was doctrine. It was trust. It was the future, arriving on the battlefield before anyone was ready for it. The radio did not end war. It did not make war humane or just. It simply changed the way war was fought. And in changing that, it changed the world. The voices that once crackled through the hedgerows of Normandy now circle the globe in satellites and fiber optic cables. The technology has evolved, but the principle remains. Communication is the foundation of coordination, and coordination is the foundation of power. The German soldier in the foxhole could not have known this. He knew only that the Americans spoke to invisible allies, and that those allies answered with fire and steel. He knew that he was alone while his enemy was connected. He knew that the voices would keep coming, would keep coordinating, would keep adjusting, would keep closing in, until there was nowhere left to hide. And he was right. The war ended. The radios were packed away. The soldiers went home. But the lesson endured. In every military academy, in every staff college, in every field manual written since 1945, the importance of tactical communications is emphasized. Officers study the battles of Normandy and the Bulge, not just for their strategic or tactical lessons, but for their communications lessons. They learn that a platoon with a radio is worth more than a company without one, that speed of information can compensate for weakness in numbers or firepower, that trust in subordinates armed with radios is more valuable than rigid control from above. The radio revolutionized warfare not by making it more violent, but by making it more responsive. It turned war from a series of isolated battles into a continuous, flowing process. It turned soldiers from isolated actors into nodes in a network. It turned commanders from directors of set-piece battles into managers of dynamic, evolving situations. These changes, subtle at first, became fundamental. Modern warfare, with its emphasis on network-centric operations, real-time intelligence, and distributed decision-making, is the direct descendant of the radio tactics developed by American forces in World War II. The Germans, in the end, were not defeated by radios alone. They were defeated by a combination of factors: industrial capacity, manpower, strategic mistakes, and the burden of fighting on multiple fronts. But the radio was part of that defeat, a significant part, a part that magnified every other Allied advantage. The radio made American artillery more deadly, American air power more precise, American infantry more coordinated, and American armor more effective. It did not win the war by itself, but it helped win every battle, and battles, accumulated over years, win wars. The voices in the air, the calm, methodical voices that so terrified German soldiers, were the sound of a new kind of warfare being born. They were the sound of information moving faster than men could run, faster than horses could gallop, faster than any physical messenger could travel. They were the sound of the 20th century asserting itself over the 19th, of industrial modernity, overwhelming traditional military practice of the future erasing the past. The German soldier in the foxhole, if he survived, went home to a destroyed country and a shattered army. He told his story to his children and grandchildren, and in those stories, the American radios loomed large. He spoke of them with a mixture of fear and admiration, as one might speak of a force of nature. He never understood, not fully, how the radios worked or why the Americans had them, and he did not. But he understood their effect. He understood that war had changed, that the old ways of fighting were obsolete, that the future belonged to those who could communicate. He was a witness to a revolution, even if he did not recognize it as such. He saw the world change, saw the nature of warfare shift beneath his feet, saw the future arrive in the form of a black box strapped to an American soldier's back. And he survived to tell about it, which is more than many could say. The radio, in the end, was more than a piece of equipment. It was a philosophy made manifest. It was the belief that information mattered, that speed mattered, that the soldier on the ground mattered enough to be trusted with the power to call down fire from the sky. It was the belief that technology should serve the human, not replace him, that machines should amplify human judgment, not substitute for it. These beliefs, embedded in the design and deployment of the SCR-300 and its descendants, shaped the American military, and through it, shaped the world. The voices continue today. They travel through different media, digital networks, satellite links, encrypted channels, but they serve the same purpose. They connect soldier to soldier, unit to unit, level to level. They turn individuals into a coordinated force. They make the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, between chaos and order. And somewhere, in a museum or a collector's shelf, an SCR-300 sits silent. Its batteries are long dead. Its circuits are corroded. Its case is dented and scratched. But once, it carried voices that changed the world. Once, it was magic.